Honorary Research Professor of Aboriginal Studies, Global Cultures and Languages at the University of Tasmania, Henry Reynolds is one of Australia's leading historians, having broken the mould of settler history and alerting us to what Indigenous people really experienced when faced with British colonisation.
I doubt if there would be a more reprehensible human act than to lead a nation into an unnecessary war. Now, the theme of my book is that Australia has been to war many, many times, and most of them have been unnecessary in the sense that Cobden was talking about. That is, they were wars fought a long way from Australia. They were fought against people who could present no possible threat to the Australian country. They were fought in countries we knew almost nothing about. We had no understanding of them, we didn't speak the languages, and they were often fought in countries where, at least in part, the conflict was a civil war. Now, if you think about it, if all the small to medium-sized countries in the world, and maybe there are 150 of them, give or take a few, if all of them behaved in the same way as Australia does, and sent their army, navy and air force halfway across the world to get involved in wars, the world would be in chaos. Now, what perplexes me is that Australia is clearly, on any objective measure, a particularly belligerent country. And yet we don't see ourselves in that way. We see ourselves as friendly, peaceful people. In other words, Australia focuses on how we fought rather than why we fought. Clearly, one of the problems we have is that it is so easy for governments to take us to war in Australia. It is so easy. The threshold for a government to go into war is so low. And then when the war is over, there is almost no assessment. There's no cost-benefit analysis. There's no looking at why we did it, whether it was worthwhile, whether the cost was worth it. It is the one important government activity that simply cannot be questioned. Now, in so many ways, behind that is the idea that survives in Australia from the early 20th century, that nations are made in war, that war is a creative force. Now, that was an idea in most countries that died on the Western Front. And yet we continue to talk about the Anzacs as creating the nation. Now, whatever on earth could those young people do to contribute to the Australia that we've developed in the early 20th century? In the commemoration that we do, we are simply feeding this idea that Australians are good at war and they should go to war when they please. And this extremely dangerous idea that we are safe if we're close to one of the great world powers. Now, my friends, that is the most dangerous place to be. That is the most dangerous place to be, and that is why we've got into so many wars in the previous century and likely to go on doing so in the future. Thank you very much.
Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees is a highly respected international scholar, poet, human rights activist and founder of the Sydney Peace Foundation and Emeritus Professor at the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney.
I'm going to sandwich what I have to say between two ideas. The first is the fascination with violence, and the second is the illiteracy about non-violence. After the carnage of the Second World War, and we inherited this wonderful edifice of laws to say that cruel and unusual punishments and the use of violence to win arguments should be outlawed. Outlawed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, outlawed eventually in the 80s in the Convention Against Torture and Cruel and Unusual Punishment. Those were the standards, those were the principles. I'm not saying that every nation adhered to them, but by and large, when people said about the Universal Declaration, that it represented the highest aspirations of men and women. That's what the hope was. That was the never again motive after the carnage of the Second World War, to establish a sense of civility via the rules of international law. And that legislation included the 1951 Refugee Convention that said it was completely legal for people to flee persecution in a country and to seek refuge in another country. We've reached a period when there's a sort of ethical free-for-all where the only arbiter of what you can do is, I'm talking about nation states around the world, are what you can get away with. You must only work in terms of pragmatism and self-interest. So the notion that there should be a set of rules and principles that we should at least mouth has been put into a sort of political waste paper basket. And I want to talk about what I would call artistic lifelines. And I often say this to politicians as well. It's much more engaging if you can learn this language. In response to the fascination with nuclear weapons, in February, Putin made a speech in which he said his weapons were so immense and so diverse that he could destroy anybody or anything anywhere on the globe. And in response to that, Trump said he would increase the nuclear weapons in possession of the United States tenfold. War is easy, just send people over the top, say yes, we'll go. But to be involved, I've been involved in peace negotiations, it's much more stretching physically, in terms of your stamina, in terms of your mind, goes on for days and weeks, than sending people to fight a war. I still believe that punishment, spite, the forces of darkness will in time be crushed by the spirit of light. So that's the note of optimism that I'll end on.